Today I'm speaking with Melanie Trecek-King. Melanie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Absolutely. And did I pronounce your middle name correctly?
It's a hyphenated last name, and yes, you did.
Awesome, awesome. And I just want to give a quick bio for Melanie. Melanie is from Iowa, and she and her husband live in Boston, Massachusetts. They have a cat with a very fun name, which I'll ask you to share in a minute. Melanie studied biology at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. She works as a science educator at a community college in Massachusetts. And she also has a platform, which we're going to focus on quite a bit towards the end of this interview, but it's called Thinking is Power, where she focuses on information literacy, science literacy, critical thinking, exposing logical fallacies, skepticism, evidence-based analysis of facts, how to evaluate claims, and inoculating students against misinformation. Their website is thinkingispower.com. And if you can check her out as well on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, the handle there is Thinking Powers. I have all the links for that beneath this video. So please go like and subscribe. And especially for her YouTube channel, she is that close to being at 1,000 subscribers. Please push it way over the edge. At the time of this interview, she's about 930 some subscribers. Let's get it way over 1,000 as soon as we can. So Melanie, thank you so much for joining us today. If you could tell us your cat's fun name and tell us more about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm married to a composer, a conductor slash composer, as you can see with the background here. And he names his cats after composers. So it's Dmitri Shostakovich. When
Wow.
Gustav Mahler passed away, we adopted Dmitri. My cat's name was Pumpkin.
So when you call the cat, do you use just the shorter first name or do you use the whole thing?
Yeah, it's Dimitri. Or have you seen the movie The Jerk?
I don't think I have.
Oh my God, Steve Martin. It is classic. Anyway, he
Okay.
has a dog in there that he calls Shithead. So
Oh
that's his.
no. It's funny when I was at college, Bible college, ironically, somebody said they want to name their dog "Damn it," so they can say "Sit, damn it, come here, damn it." Crazy.
Yeah.
Well, tell us
Yeah.
more about yourself.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm from Iowa, little tiny town. Fun fact here. I graduated with 39, and that was half my county. I, to this day, don't know how to parallel park. I will drive around the block until I find a spot, and I refuse to drive in Boston. But I do love to travel. My husband and I have been to about 50 countries now, which means that there's like another 142 to go.
Wow,
So looking forward to that.
I'm
Um,
jealous.
yeah, oh gosh, traveling. There's nothing like learning by traveling. Um, and let's see, other fun facts. I am crazy cat lady. I don't have kids. I never wanted kids. And cats are about the level of responsibility I can handle, which is sometimes too much. So, yeah.
That's awesome. I was curious, how often do you get to your husband's concerts?
Well, sometimes he gives like 50 to 60 a year. So, not honestly, not that as often anymore. We met in choir in college,
Nice.
and that was a very long time ago. We've been married over half our lives now. And I do like to sing, and sometimes I sing in his concerts, but otherwise I go depending on the level of how much I need to be there and or my interest. But
Mhm.
he has a lot. I mean, look, if I'm being honest, he has a lot. He's a scholar of African American music, specifically slave songs, and
Wow,
works spirituals, protest songs. And so he does amazing work, but it's just a lot, right? So.
that's awesome. I was going to say too, with the you being in Massachusetts and specifically in Boston, just a quirky thing. I've always loved the show Cheers. Have you ever seen that? And I don't know if they're what they have there for a landmark, but I would love to come see whatever's there at some point. I've watched Cheers far too many times. I want more times than I want to admit. But
There's the bar. You can actually go to the Cheers. I don't know if it's the original one, but it's at Faneuil Hall with like all the touristy stuff. And
okay, it's at
you
least like
can,
a remake of it.
yeah,
That's cool. Yeah, I need to get up there at some point and do that. I'm a big fan.
Austin's a cool city. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, at this point, I would love to just invite you, if you could, to share your story. We invite people to talk primarily, starting at the point of childhood of where your worldview, how your worldview shaped. What was your family all about telling you? What was church like as a kid, and just how did your worldview form and evolve as you grew up?
Yeah, so I grew up in Western Iowa in a little town, and as I said, very rural. My town didn't have a stoplight. I learned to drive in a cornfield. I can drive a tractor. I can drive a stick, but I can't parallel park. Um, and the community really revolved around the church. And in particular, there was one church that the vast majority of people went to that, it was a fundamentalist church. It was a young earth creationist church. The earth was 6,000 years old. God created everything as it currently exists today. Um, and importantly, God created man and then created woman out of him to serve him. And that her temptation of him was the cause of all the sin in the world. And so women had a place in the church. And I remember I was in high school and um, my mom's Sunday school teacher got sick. And she volunteered to take over while he was sick. And they took it to the church board. And over the next few months, now this is my adult brain trying to make sense of what happened at the time. This is what I remember. Um, they decided that women's roles needed to be restricted in the church as official policy. And so women could not teach men over the age of, I think it was like 16 or 17. So basically, Sunday school for kids. There was a woman master of Sunday schools. They went to her husband to tell her she couldn't do that anymore.
Mm.
Um, they actually, I think I remember them changing the lock so she couldn't get in without his permission.
Wow.
Um, and all of this is in the background of my mom is a really strong woman who raised me basically all by herself. I mean, my dad was around, but he wasn't really an active parent. And my mom is a strong person who ran the business, who ran the home. My parents had a restaurant in this small town. But she's always had this, she wants to believe her parents. You're getting my family story here. So my great grandmother crossed the country on a covered wagon from Pennsylvania, so she's Pennsylvania Dutch, to Western Iowa. My mom grew up
Wow.
in without running water, without electricity in some cases, like went to the bathroom in an outhouse, that kind of thing. So very, very poor. My grandma went through eighth grade education, and my grandpa went through sixth grade education. And my mom was the product of this. There was a lot of superstitious beliefs, and this idea that believing in God was virtuous. It was a good thing, right? It was wholesome. It was the right thing to do. And so when we moved to this other town, the church professed these ideas, and um, you know, cloaking them in religion this way, it's hard to. It was hard for her to reject them. So she would send this to this church, but on our own time, she would say, Melanie, you can do anything anybody with a penis can do. Like she would literally tell me that, except standing up, actually. Pee standing up is what she would tell me. And I remember in college, I went to Lithuania, went to Eastern Europe for the first time. And that's where I realized that a lot of the world's women pee standing up in the squatting toilets. And so I remember calling her like, hey, mom, you're wrong, actually. I don't need to sit pee. Anyway, all that's to say, my mom was trying to train me to be this strong woman, and then I'd go to this church, and then I'd hear what my place was, and then I was the cause of all badness in the world, and so had to pay penance for all of my life and serve men, and it was very confusing.
Mm.
Um, I
It's amazing
remember,
how that theology runs so deep, and when you dig deep into the other aspects of that mythology, where originally the first wife of Adam was probably Lilith, and she actually lost her privilege to be his wife because she wouldn't obey, and just the endless the Watchers and Enoch, where the women were so uh, beautiful and so seductive that literally the angels in heaven had to come down and copulate with them. Like women are just that horrible to the purity of the angels and the men. It's amazing how deep this runs. Plus all the rules about you're impure so many days of the month, and sit outside the camp and all this stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah. In hindsight, it is a trauma that I still deal with, like being taught that you are fundamentally impure and the cause of bad things. Um, I remember going to college. So I wanted to be a veterinarian. And so I was majoring in biology and chemistry, like all good pre-vets do, and taking my science classes. And most people think that that's where my deconversion happened, but it wasn't. That preconditioning to reject the science of evolution is really strong. I was armed with all of that. But I remember sitting in World Civ 1, like ancient civilizations, and the professor was talking about the ancient river civilizations. I think I remember there was four, and how each of the different river civilizations has, I in my brain am sitting in this desk as an 18, 19-year-old in college, listening to this professor talking about these old river civilizations. And this one had environmental conditions that, that constantly flooded and there were lots of storms and so on. But this one was, the environmental conditions had a nice stable climate and so on. And so this one created gods that were vengeful and wrathful and that would like cause all these natural disasters. And these were, I remember like this is like building up in my head. Holy shit. Humans made God, man made God, not the other way around. And it was like, wow, does that make sense? That made so much sense. And then after that, it was just like a click. Everything made sense. Because of course, men are trying to compensate for their weaknesses by blaming someone else, right? And so blame who's the cause of our temptation? Who's the cause of the sin? Who do we need to control the behavior and the reproduction so we make sure the kids are ours? Right? It's women. And that just in my head made so much sense. And yeah, after that, it was so much a part of my identity, of my core belief systems. And again, I had been taught that not believing in those things made me a bad person. So I'm like, can I take aspects of this and keep it? Um, and it did take me a while to sort of sort things out. I still deal with the trauma. But I think more than that, the trauma really comes from seeing how that religion is still used to treat women as if they don't matter as much. But I think it's more than that. It's not just the religious aspect. Religion has been used to justify cultural sexism. And that's true in basically every religion and every culture, with a few exceptions. And so to me, what it seems like is what's bothersome is to continue to see this like misogyny and sexism that's so steeped in our culture and justified by religion. But it's like the proverbial fish in water that doesn't know it's in water. Like we can't even see it because it's so pervasive. And so it's so frustrating for me because I went through that extreme and I saw it, I experienced it, and I now whenever I see it and it's everywhere, I just want to shout like, "Hey, folks, don't you realize that all of this sexism, there's no need for it. These systems are in place." If I might go back to like the pronunciation of my name. My last name is Trecek-King. So Trecek is a Bohemian name. My dad's family came from Bohemia, and there's a huge settlement of Bohemians in Omaha. My husband and I both hyphenated our names. So after I left religion, I realized, why do women change their names? Well, it's because they were property and they were passed on from person to person, father to husband. That was not something I wanted to do. So when we were engaged, I said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to change my name. And then he came to me and said, actually, I want us to have the same name. And so I said, well, I don't know what we do with that. And so we settled on hyphenating. And so both of us hyphenated. His last name was King. My last name was Trecek. So now we're Trecek-King. My husband has a maiden name.
That's awesome.
And like the kinds of flack that he's taken for that over his life, and also the number of people that assume that his name was Trecek-King and I just took it, right? All of that comes back to religion and justifying that power structure within religion.
Hmm.
Sorry, that was a long story.
That's an amazing context. Could I ask, just to go back to your childhood a little bit, in the midst of all the issues that you were obviously very adept at seeing very early on, which is awesome, because a lot of us drank the Kool-Aid and didn't really question things early, but myself included, by leaps and bounds. But in that, was there any sense in the evangelical message of, besides the all the different rules and culture of Christianity and the Bible, was there any simple message that got through of, you're a sinner, you need a savior, Jesus is there, he rescued you because he died on the cross in your place and took your punishment, he rose again, proving he can do it for you too? Was that message, did that come through? And did you ever have a point at which you said a prayer, or came forward in a church and said, yeah, I want to place my personal faith in Christ as my savior?
That is a really good question. And what my memory of it is, because I did get baptized. In my church, you weren't baptized as a baby. You had to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior and choose to be baptized. And I did choose to be baptized, and I was. But it was also because that's what all the cool kids did, right? The youth group at church, I cannot express to you how small of a community this was. That's where the cool kids were, right? It was the youth group at school, and the that's what you did in your free time was church stuff. And so, wow, the cool kids got to go up front and be baptized and, be the center of that attention. And I wanted to do that too. That said, I loathed getting up on Sunday morning, and I tried to get out of it as much as possible. I hated Sunday school, and I remember asking questions. Wow, you're really good at this. I remember asking questions really early, like I don't know how old I was, but very young, and we were talking about. I remember asking the Sunday school teacher, but people speak a lot of different languages. Like, how is it that, you know, Jesus would come and speak English, and then like all of these other people wouldn't understand what he was saying. Like, well, actually, Jesus didn't speak English. Wait, what? Okay, so Jesus spoke Aramaic. Okay, how common was that? Well, not very, actually. Okay. Well, but then how do all of these people who speak different languages? Oh, that's the Tower of Babel. And how God had to divide people by language because they were conspiring against him. I'm like, I don't, does that make sense? I don't think so. Yeah. So, but those kinds of questions, it was always like the social kinds of questions, cultural kinds of questions, history, not necessarily the science. I feel like they did a really good job of arming me as a young earth creationist against the kinds of arguments, science-based arguments.
Hmm. It's interesting you mentioned the Tower of Babel. That was one thing that I always question too, and I've got a whole list of things I'm working on. I'm actually doing some live streams eventually, where I just talk about things that did make sense and should have been a cause of concern, but I just kind of chalked it up to, I'll figure it out someday. But that was one of them. And I always thought, if God's desire was to split the languages, number one, that doesn't make sense. But number two, all it takes is one generation where in the next, like say a tribe here that and the tribe here that used to speak the same language, they're now speaking different languages. You get babies and toddlers that grow up exposed to both languages. Within one generation, they're now bilingual and can help each other communicate. So it's like, it doesn't take very long to fix that problem. It really doesn't. And you can learn each other's languages eventually. And it's amazing the little issues that come up when you really think through it. But was there a point though where you specifically felt the call, that's like that you were really, not because of church culture, but you just really needed a savior? Did that ever get through? And did you feel like there was that sense of Jesus died for me personally?
I think it was just taken as a given,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like it just was true. And yeah, I I remember at one point giving my mother this like limited edition painting of somebody nailing Jesus to the cross, but Jesus was still like there to save him. It wasn't even something that needed to be questioned. It was just true. Does that make sense?
It does. I guess what I mean is there is a point there where you have to kind of make it your own if you're going to, and you'd have to have that sense of saying, I definitely humbly admit I am a wretch, I am a sinner, I am a wicked person. This isn't just like I just know that he's historically died for me. It's that I know that he, if I had been the only person in the Garden of Eden and I'd sinned, I didn't eaten the fruit, he would have died for me. He would have done it. He would have had to do it. He would have done it. And I would have needed to say, this is a free gift. I can't work my way to heaven. I have to admit, I'm not attempting to be a good person. I am saying I'm not the guy that's drowning in the water. I'm the corpse at the bottom of the ocean that's already dead and gone. And Jesus has come down and given me new life in a way that was, in a sense, passive. But he's simply saying, you can't add to your salvation, but you do need to accept it as a free gift by faith, that this is not your work. This is my work on the cross. Did you ever have a point at which you said, yeah, no, I'm staking my claim in the ground. I admit I'm a wicked sinner, and I admit he's a wonderful savior. He died in my place. Did that feel like that was part of the baptism conversations or any other time frame?
The whole thing for me was so sex-based that t- the message that I heard was that I was bad because I was female,
Mm,
and that m- females were the cause of all sin in the world. And to me, that always fundamentally felt off. And it wasn't that I was bad because I was a sinner. It was I was bad because I was born female.
mm,
And so accepting Jesus, it wasn't necessarily like I needed to accept Jesus to save me from this condition. It was more that I was bad and the cause of all wrong in the world, so I need to accept my place in this world, which is less than.
mm.
And that was what always felt like it it didn't seem right.
Yeah.
It certainly felt like, I mean, my husband and I like to travel. Um, a few years ago, we went to East Africa for the first time, and we were at the first time we were at a border crossing between Uganda and Rwanda, and the border guard asked my husband how much he paid for me. Now, that was the first time somebody asked Anthony how much he paid for me. It was not the last, but he was like, she was free. Now, that was the wrong answer because that meant I was valueless. And so after that, it became, well, she's priceless. But the number of people I tell the story to, and their response is like, well, like, oh, and then they kind of, chuckle about it and, oh, that's culture or that's religion or whatever it is. Okay. Um, but imagine for a second any scenario in which somebody asked me how much I paid for him, right? That reaction is the same kind of reaction that we should have when somebody asks a man how much he paid for a woman. Yet the fact that we don't have that same reaction shows just how deep cultures have used religion to justify a sex-based hierarchy.
Yeah. It's amazing. I think you're right on target that we can't even see it. It's just so thick. It's part of our psyche at this point. And especially when you grow up in it, there's so many things. I feel like it's one of those things where you can truly deconvert and still spend years pulling the roots up from this thing. It's so deep. And I think it's one of the most beautiful things though, to at least have a starting point to say, wow, like I've truly seen the world and the other people, the lovely people in it so wrongly, and to at least try to reframe the way you think and interpret people, and just certainly the empowerment. I love that topic has come up a lot with my girls. I've got 4 kids and 2 young girls, 2 boys, 2 girls, and I love that that's become a major source of our conversations. Is just you're special and you're just as powerful and you can do anything you want to, and your body is yours and you can say yes and no, and it's a beautiful thing to start to change that, shift that culture. But yeah, for those of us that grew up in it, it's crazy how much we just it's taken for granted. Do you feel like that topic then kept you from really being able to, when they did preach the message of you just need Jesus as your savior, did it feel like that was a stumbling block to really moving forward in what we would have called your personal relationship with Christ?
Yeah, I've wondered a lot over the years, had I been raised in a church that wasn't so overtly sexist to just moderately sexist, like a lot of them are, if I had wouldn't have been so primed to leave it. And I don't know the answer to that. I,
Hmm,
as it stands, yeah, the it just seems so fundamentally wrong to me. And again, I had a mom who was telling me otherwise, and I appreciated that message.
that's awesome. It's interesting too, thinking about how early Christianity was very much more balanced in some of the groups, at least, where they would talk a lot about the Holy Spirit as in the feminine, and they would talk a lot about Sophia, of course, that she was still a big part of this, and even some of the mythology that's woven into it with the two Marys at the foot of the cross, and like that was very much they understood where that all came from. They were weaving mythologies that they already knew into this new mythology, but in many ways it was not even very well cloaked. And the feminine was part of it, the divine feminine, and there were the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, I think it was, other Gospels where you had women being a big part of this. And it is amazing to think about how much, if politics had just gone a little differently, it could have stayed that way, but obviously history didn't work that way, and it became much more patriarchal. But it breaks your heart to think about the fact that this was much more balanced at one point. Although obviously I'm fighting against mythology on any level. I wouldn't want to perpetuate it even with the Sophia stuff still in it. I
But like today, the largest organization isn't Catholicism the world's largest religion still?
think so.
So this is a power structure that's built on women not being pure enough, important enough, holy enough to be in the power structure,
Yeah.
right? The whole thing is based on men. And the fact that we still teach this to young people, not just little girls, but oh my goodness, little boys. We need to stop teaching young kids that their sexual anatomy somehow determines how worthy they are.
Yeah. And with the Catholic Church, they even, despite venerating Mary, they're still so patriarchal, which is crazy. They do a much better job, if you could put it that way, of putting women in an important spot, with Mary being so important as the mother, holy mother of God, as it were. But still, even despite that difference from the Protestant churches, they're still very patriarchal, and I'm sure we're not going to see a female pope in our lifetime.
But even think about so they venerate Mary, but Mary is a virgin. They venerate a woman who has been untouched by man. That is her value. Her
Yeah,
value is in not being sullied, in not being impure. That's just, it seems so, in an alternate universe where this stuff wasn't loaded with God, it seems so harmful to kids' psyche to teach them that your value as a woman, you could have value as a woman, but only if you're never touched by a man.
yeah. And if you mess up, you're pretty much irredeemable. I mean, at best, you're going to be a redeemed, from the gutter kind of person, but it's still like far from the ideal. Yeah. Did you ever see back in the purity culture high days, Joshua Harris with I Kiss Dating Goodbye?
No.
There was a book that Joshua Harris was kind of a teenage, young adult superstar back a while ago. He's like fully deconverted as far as I know now, but which is ironic. But he wrote this book called I Kiss Dating Goodbye. And if I remember correctly, it started with this idea of you're at your wedding, and your bride comes in, and you as a guy are there, but then next to your bride comes in all the other girls that you've kissed or touched or slept with or something, and it's almost like it's like a way of saying your marriage doesn't mean that much because you've touched these other girls first. And of course, he launches into why you should be focused more on courtship and keeping everything pure, and only waiting pretty much for all touching until you're married. But that got into a lot of people's psyches. And I think a lot of people, when they did mess up, they felt like they had this hope for a redemption story, but that sense of like, at best, if I can keep it kind of quiet and no one knows the full story, I'll look like I've got a good Christian marriage. But I know in my heart, I'm not worth that much. And that shame-based stuff is just awful. It eats at people. So did you, on that note, did you have much exposure to purity culture, I'd imagine, where with the women being subservient and women being the cause of all the trouble that you had to make sure you were never a stumbling block to men?
Oh, yes, I remember distinctly. Usually old men shoving a coin in my face saying, "This is the birth control you need." You know, just keep it between your knees. And that's all you need to do. Oh.
Do
Mm.
they have many rules in your church for conservative dress, like, dresses down to your ankles or anything?
I don't remember that so much. It was generally understood that you weren't promiscuous and that you definitely no sex before marriage. Um, this was also at the height of the Satanic Panic. I think I'm a bit older than you are. Do you remember the Satanic Panic?
Like Frank Peretti and the This Present Darkness kind of stuff?
Oh, I don't even know who that is.
He was an author that wrote books about like you need to imagine that there are angels and demons fighting around you at all times because they really are.
So the Satanic Panic was in the like 80s and 90s, and it was this idea that the devil was everywhere and was out to get you. So
Yeah.
there was like Dungeons and Dragons. Like I remember my Sunday school having lessons on Dungeons and Dragons because that was the devil. Backwards masking, like playing rock songs backwards and then, getting possessed by the devil. Ouija boards for sure. But also things like um, Stevie Nicks concerts. She would cast spells on people, or movies like, oh, there was The Exorcist and the Amityville Horror, and but like Procter and Gamble had to change their symbol that they had had for, I'm guessing, around a century or something because people had looked and seen patterns in there like the stars are pentagrams and this makes a 666 and this is the devil's beard and this is the horns and stuff. The devil was everywhere. And so there was this constant fear of the devil. And I did grow up in that with this like um, um, we're fighting against Satan and the devil. And, Halloween, my mom would let us dress up for Halloween and we would have a good time, but we'd come home with like little notes in our buckets or with, this is the devil's holiday and they're possessing your kids and stuff. So that kind of stuff, this idea of this existential battle between good and evil was always there. And the end times were going to come soon, right? The world was going to end in a fiery ball, but Jesus was going to come save those who believed in him, and everybody else was going to go to hell. So
Did you
there
feel
was
like
this,
that was real to you? Like you really bought into that?
oh yeah, it was just understood to be true. You know what I mean? Like one of those things that you accept as true without questioning, at least for me.
I went to a mission school after Bible college, a mission school called New Tribes Mission. They're like Wycliffe Bible translators. They try to do tribal evangelism in jungle environments, and that was my life goal, to be a Bible translator in a tribe somewhere. But we went through a lot of talk for a long time about the difference between beliefs and worldviews, and where beliefs are what you profess and what you can learn about, but worldview is what you truly believe on the deep, deeper psychological level. For example, you could say to someone, do you believe you're lovable and wonderful? And they say, of course, God loves me, I believe that. And then but if you ask the right questions, if you say, do you really believe you're lovable? If you get psychologically real with these people and they're like, you know what, if I'm honest, I feel like garbage, and they'll start crying. Like, okay, so your belief is you're lovable. Your worldview is you're absolutely trash. And I feel like that it sounds like you're saying you had some things that were beliefs of people around you, but that for you it was almost like some of it was just your worldview. It was so deep, so early that you just knew, and you don't know, you almost didn't have to like stake your claim like, yes, I know Jesus is the savior. It's just you just knew it. It's just almost an assumption at that point. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it was an assumption. It just was a given. It was true.
Yeah. Hmm. Did people try to get you more serious about your personal faith at any point? Did they try to kind of say, like, look, it sounds like you do believe it. You obviously go to church, you go to youth group, you know the verses, you've heard the sermons, you sing the songs, but like, maybe other evidences where they might say, are you evangelizing? We don't hear you sharing the gospel with people. You need to be on fire for the Lord. Did anyone try to take you to the next level of spirituality?
So this was all like what I remember pre-college. And no, because again, it was just a given. And this was such a small community that everybody basically had these same beliefs. It was more the idea that the devil was out there and that we needed to be protect ourselves and our community from that. Um, so I remember being armed up to go to college because that's where they were really going to try and convert me or something. But I do remember questioning, like when my mom had that issue with her Sunday school teacher, and I remember all of those changes happening and questioning those things. And I, gosh, I don't know if I think that God has just ordained me as being less than human. And the youth minister came to our house to talk to me. That I needed to know what my place was, basically. And um,
In terms of submission to men?
yes,
Well,
yeah. Um, and yeah, it was horrible. I was primed to leave, but I just keep thinking about all the people who haven't left, not just women, but men. That is not a worldview um, that contributes to the well-being of people in general. And it's an unnecessary one, and it's a harmful and shameful one. No one should be shamed for being who they are. And that's what my church was teaching me, was that I held this deep-seated shame for all of the sin in the world because I was female. And gosh, it's a terrible thing to teach children.
yeah, I've said too a lot with my interviews the idea of I think the Catholics do a better job at this, better in quotes, but with all their icons of Jesus and the statues of Jesus being tortured on the cross, and then telling both boys and girls, like, look, you're so wicked that someone literally had to be tortured for your sake. Like, that's how bad this was. And this is your fault that he's up there. And there was a lot of messages that we got, like in Bible college, about, if you do something sinful, something small, even something as horrible as horror, masturbation, if you do this, it's basically the same thing as you're going back in time to Christ on the cross, and you're getting your ladder up there and you're nailing another nail in his wrists or his legs, or you're cutting his side with a spear. It's like this, these are the things for which Christ died. And he died for them both in the past for all the people before Christ. He died for them, their sins, but also he died for all the sins of the future, prospectively. And therefore, when you sin today, that's literally a sin for which Christ died. So why do you want to, in a sense, add to the list of sins for which Christ died? Choose righteousness and choose holiness. And it is amazing the way that works. And you do it's I say this a lot, but you do end up often too having, it creates like a Jekyll and Hyde mentality for people, where they feel like they can't be honest about how much they struggle, because they don't want to be seen as that awful person that's sort of metaphorically nailing another nail into the cross of Christ. You want to be seen as someone that's holy and making a difference for the kingdom. And therefore, especially if you're in ministry, especially a real big ministry like missionary or pastor, you really have to have this public facade where you're like, I'm kind of above that. Like, I've kind of graduated to this higher level of holiness. Yeah, I struggle occasionally with my doubts, or I struggle occasionally with I pray 1 hour a day, but I don't pray 3 hours a day like I sometimes should. These holy struggles, but the real mundane struggles, like, you can't admit those. If you do that, they're gonna crucify you. You're gonna be disqualified in their minds as a person to be listening to. And I think it really does create a world where so many people feel like there's no choice but to simply not be honest about who they really are and what they're, quote unquote, struggling with. But can I ask, I wanted to go back for a second to the idea of the college stuff. It almost sounded, the way you described it, like they were poisoning the well, like those horrible secular people are going to mislead you. Could you tell us more about like what was the messaging of how did they poison the well? How did they tell you this is going to be a bad outcome if you don't stay on our strict, straight and narrow?
Yeah. If I might just go back for a second
Yeah,
and
please.
because um, I'm going back to like we're all doing the best with what we have. And I know my mom was doing the best with what she had. And to my mom, believing in God was the right thing to do. And then, therefore, taking us to this church was the right thing to do. And I don't think that enough people question that assumption. This idea that believing in God is a useful belief because it can be harmful. And just because it's belief in God does not make it wholesome or the right thing to do. And I just go back to that a lot because I, again, know people that want to believe for that very reason that that's what good people do, right? Is that they believe in God. And there's so much peer pressure around that that therefore, if you don't believe, you're not a good person. And then there's even that like mistaken assumption that you can't be good without God. And I probably could make a pretty decent argument that we can be better without God. Um, but that is so drilled within people that I think a lot of people don't get past that level of questioning just because they think it's the right thing to do without seeing the damage that it's doing. Um, yeah. So that was just my bookend on that. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and it definitely even like I think of the doubting Thomas story a lot, where the virtue is not to ask for evidence, is not to ask for more information, is to simply believe without question, just because someone said it. We saw Jesus, and we saw him walk through the walls here, and he spent time with us disciples apart from you, Thomas, and you should just believe us, without any evidence. And he's virtue. The virtue is not his doubt. The virtue is his would have been his faith, and it's so backwards, but yet it's amazing how that gets drilled into you. Like you are not a good person if you doubt this message. You're only a good person if you simply believe. And I think when you add to that, of course, the whole ostracization and shunning that happens, like if you deviate at all, like we will give you hell to pay for it. They know how to keep you on the straight and narrow. It's very much a carrot and stick, both in terms of heaven and hell, as well as in your church community and versus secular community. I did just mention the word hell. I meant to ask, did you fear hell and
Oh,
did you expect heaven?
oh, hell, burning in all of eternity in hell for punishment for my sins was definitely a motivator.
Hmm. Did you think heaven was going to be a good place, and did you expect to go there?
I hoped to go there. That was the goal. Um, and yes, heaven was the happy place, right, for all eternity. Uh, it's a very oversimplified worldview.
Did you have any specific things you looked forward to in heaven?
Seeing all my loved ones and my pets that had passed. Although in some people's telling, they went to heaven, sorry, and others they don't have souls. Um, I have a funny story on that if you want to come back to it later. But to segue into what you were asking about, because this was a young Earth creationist church, and the world was going to end soon, and there was, the strict hierarchy, males, females. We didn't have, by the way, racial minorities in our area, so that was not an issue. In that there wasn't like deep-seated racism built into the church because it wasn't part of our purview. But as far as atheists and scientists and evolutionists are all one and the same. And they all were going to try to convince me that the Bible, as it says, wasn't literally true, to that was the devil tempting me. But the truth was that the Earth was 6,000 years old, and the story in Genesis, like one of the stories, I don't know, was literally true, and this is how we interpreted it. And so, any deviation from this is the evidence, and actually the evidence shows that. And so here's all the reasons we have to support that. So when I would go to science class, then yeah, I'd be armed with that in my head, like, oh yeah, they're telling me that because of course that's what my church told me they were going to tell me. But again, like it was pretty effective until biogeography. Actually, I remember that pretty explicitly. So biogeography is the spatial distribution of living organisms. And the spatial distribution of living organisms is a function of their evolutionary history. So, like, hummingbirds are only found in the New World. Penguins are only in the southern hemisphere, puffins in the northern hemisphere. Uh, Sloths only exist in Central America. There's like 50 different species, I'm guessing, of mosquitoes in the Hawaiian Islands. Oh, and while we're on islands, the Hawaiian Islands have one native, their only native mammals are bats, which fly. They have lots of native birds. Um, it's really hard to cross that distance of ocean saltwater. So, like, they have very few native freshwater vertebrates. They've got like no native snakes. Actually, I think except for one that looks like an earthworm. All of this comes down to like, why would a god after the flood put all of these organisms in these places? Like, penguins can live in the Arctic. Why aren't they there? Why are they only down there? Right? Why do we only find um, certain species on certain islands? None of that made sense without evolution. None of it made sense without evolution. And I just remember sitting there thinking, but wait a minute. So according to Noah's flood, everything would have died off except for two of each pair, like 4,000 years ago. But then why do we have genetic evidence that links this with this? And that goes back like hundreds of thousands of years. And for that matter, why do we have like writing records from civilizations 8,000 years ago in Asia? None of that made any sense. And so they had armed me for those arguments. But I think in my mind, what happened was I was primed to leave because of the innate shame I was taught because of being female. My history teacher had planted a pretty big seed. And then when I finally did allow myself to be open to arguments, they just became so obvious that I couldn't understand why I thought any other way.
I can relate to some of that. I definitely was armed to the teeth with the contra arguments as well against evolution and all that. And it was a very weird experience for me when I finally deconverted. My path was not about science and about critical thinking as much, although critical thinking came into it a little bit, but it was more about the pure mythology, like seeing that the Gospel of Mark, for example, was structured according to the signs of the zodiac in the right order, seeing that they'd copied from the Homeric epics.
Wait, what?
The Gospel of Mark is structured according to the signs of the zodiac in the right order of the signs, and seeing like the work of Dennis MacDonald, if you know that, where they copied Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, Euripides' Bacchae, and they were literally copying from it in terms of story structure as well as actual quotes. Seeing the way that the pantheon, the mystery cult pantheons were copied. So, for example, Helios, the sun god, he had a purple robe and he had the sun rays around his head. So Jesus wears a purple robe and a crown of thorns. Dionysius turns water into wine and rides into town on a donkey. Jesus does the same thing. Zeus cries tears of blood and water. Jesus does too. Hermes, the Flash, walks on water with his golden slippers. Jesus does too. Over and over, this stuff just kept on pounding at my head. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I can't ignore the fact this looks like they took a whole bunch of other stuff, including, of course, the Old Testament mimesis, where they're copying from Jesus is the new Moses, he's the new David, he's the new Joshua, he's the new Israel. He's the new Adam, of course. They kept on copying from all these sources, Old Testament and beyond, to make up the Jesus character. But that was what deconverted me. But my deconversion, it all, like I studied for about 3 or so years, not thinking I was going to deconvert. I would have said it almost in that entire time frame that the outcome of being an atheist is this most ridiculous possibility. There's just no way. Atheism is ridiculous. There has to be someone that started this thing. Obviously, the balls are moving. When you walk into a room and there's a billiards table there and the balls are moving and you didn't happen to see what happened right before then, but you come in and the balls are moving, you assume someone just hit them with a cue stick. Um, there has to be a reason. There's something rather than nothing. Those things came together to me to say, there's got to be a creator. There's got to, and of course, the beauty of life, the beauty of children, babies, the beauty of all these things that we see, the beauty of a sunset. There's got to be a designer to this, and the math, the Fibonacci sequence, and all that stuff. There's got to be a designer behind all this stuff. But when I got to the very end, I was just sitting at my computer on a Saturday morning and listening to somebody, maybe Hitchens or somebody, who knows, but something hit. And it was, I like to describe it as like, when you set up dominoes and you flick the first one, they all fall. It was like I had that worldview of dominoes, but as I was learning about mythology, I was walking, but I was a mile away. And as I was kicking, my kicks didn't actually knock my worldview dominoes down because I was just too far away from it. But eventually, without my sort of prescience about it, I happened to be at the very last stage and I was right next to that first domino. My foot was right there and I kicked it and they all fell. And I deconverted. It just hit me within an hour. I was like, is it possible that there's not a God? Is this possible that this is all mythology? And I was arguing like with myself, like, no, there's no way we've all been deceived for 2,000 years, millions and billions of people. No way. I was like, well, we always thought the Buddhists were mistaken and the Muslims were mistaken. Why couldn't we have been mistaken? And I was like arguing, say it, Tim, say the words. It's not real. And I finally was like, it's not real. And all the dominoes just fell instantly. But within that hour, the things you're talking about suddenly, like the ramifications began hitting quickly. It's like, I wonder if evolution might be real. I wonder if the earth is really old. I wonder if the whole universe is, and it just was like, oh my gosh. And it just, all these things that I've been fighting that, like you were talking about, the things that they set you up for your ability to fight against so hard, I realized it's all backwards. Everything I've been learning is backwards. I've been in the upside down, and it's now time to put it right side up. And it was amazing the way that those pieces began to hit. And I wasn't like concluding anything. I was just saying, if Christianity's mythology, then there's all kinds of things I need to think through immediately. If this doesn't make sense, then that stuff doesn't make sense.
May I
You know what
ask
I mean?
how,
What was that?
may I ask how old you were?
Sure, I'm 47.
No. How old were you when that happened?
It was 4 years ago, so I was 43.
Oh my God. That had to have been like wow.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was very crazy, especially because I wasn't just like a cultural Christian. My whole life's goal was to be a pastor and a Bible translator. Everything in me, and I'd memorized thousands of verses voluntarily. You just everything you could list off. I've been to Bible college to be a preacher. Loved it. Everything in me was just the word of God, the kingdom, the gospel. There was no part of it that was cultural to me. I wanted to turn the world upside down for Jesus Christ, and I loved it. I loved what I did for the Lord. I mean, I say I loved it. Loved it at that time. He was the lover of my soul. Why wouldn't I give my life gladly to say thank you for my salvation and to tell other people there was a way out of the prison of sin? And so for me to realize it at 43 was like, holy smokes, I have given my life to a delusion. And like Paul says, if the resurrection is not true, you're of all people to be most pitied. Tim, you were the sucker in the room, and it hit hard. But I'll tell you what, a lot of people are very upset at that point because like, oh my gosh, like I've lost so much, and that's real. I definitely feel like you said about heaven. I lost heaven and the afterlife, and that still hurts to this day. I still wish I could live forever. I know people say, oh, you wouldn't want to. I would, um, but I honestly, within that first hour, almost started laughing because I was like, oh my gosh, this has all been a joke. This is all just a big joke. And I was like, you could have easily gone to your deathbed thinking this was real. At least you probably have a few years left to redeem it. But you have friends left and right that are going to go to their deathbeds thinking this is all real, and they're not going to live a day of their lives. And I kind of laughed, like I just won the lottery. And that mentality helped me a lot to heal, despite the fact that I couldn't believe that eternity was not there for me. And I still struggle with it. Again, I know people say you wouldn't want to live forever. I really, really would. I really would want to live forever. And it still bites me. And I say a lot, Christianity broke my heart. It definitely broke my heart.
So if I could ask, I'm 47 too, by the way. So I deconverted, I'm gonna guess like 18 to 20.
Okay.
Um,
So
so
been out
I've
for a while.
majority of my life, yeah, without what would you say to yourself, your younger self?
If I could go back in time,
Yeah.
it might change. The message might change over time, but I think at the moment, the biggest thing would simply be they have told you almost nothing about where this religion came from, and you need to know. Like, for example, one of my big research projects has been the Book of Enoch, and I never knew much about it. I'd never read it. In my research, I found that the New Testament quotes it 200 times. That's far more than any other book in the Old Testament. Like, Jesus was drenched in the Book of Enoch. And if you read the great work from Michael Heiser, he talks about basically how the Gospels are in many ways structured to basically undo the damage that is described in the Book of Enoch. They're undoing it. They're unweaving. They're backward, making it backwards. It's like I went to Bible college. Why didn't any professor ever mention the Book of Enoch to me? Not once. That doesn't make sense. So I think I would tell myself there's so much more. Either they don't know or they're hiding it, and you need to know. I think that's what I'd say. What would you tell yourself if you could have gone back to the younger you when you were obviously a younger person than I was at my age deconverting? But what would you have told yourself as maybe as a teenager or preteen?
Yeah. What worked for me was the realization that man made God, God didn't make man. And I think that message would have landed pretty early. I really do.
Mm,
And
mm,
by man, I really do mean man. Men made God in his image, not the other way around.
yeah, and arguably some very bad bad men at that. Um, I I'm
And
sorry.
that, right? You don't have to believe in God to be a good person. Actually, if the reason that you're not killing someone is because you're afraid of eternal damnation, that does not make you a good person.
Yeah,
Like, I can have morals and ethics and live by those without the threat of eternal damnation. And I think most of us can. And so this idea that we need like a, sky dandy to punish us for all eternity if we don't behave, I don't think that's true.
yeah. I often bring that issue up too, the related issue of the Yahweh character being a bad character, where he threatens people and is constantly hurting people. And I'll say something like, you know how we use a cast iron pan to cook something? And imagine I as your daddy, crank that cast iron pan up and put some oil in it. If I took just like your little pinky and I put it in the oil for just 1 second, would I be a good daddy or a bad daddy? And I'll kind of like, without being, creating nightmares for them, I'll kind of just crank it up a little bit. Like, what if I put your whole hand in? Would I be a good dad? And of course, they're always going to say you'd be a bad daddy if you ever did that. What if I held it in for a whole like 30 seconds? Oh, you'd be a horrible daddy. Say, well, God does that kind of stuff to people, but He does it forever and ever and ever and ever. And then we go to church and saying you're a good father. And then we talk about the Noah story. I said, if I took you to the pool and drowned you, would I be a good daddy or bad? Oh, you'd be a bad daddy for drowning us. Well, if there was a God that drowned all of his kids, and of course they're going to conclude, oh, you'd be a horrible daddy. Well, why do we say that God drowned all of his kids except for Noah and his family, and then he's a good daddy? And they put the pieces together pretty well. For kids, they're able to think through it and like, yeah, this is not a good character. How we ever think of him as benevolent is beyond me. But I mean, I know it because I was stuck in it. But
The Ten Commandments, for example. So, this is a conversation I try to have with my mom sometimes. Like, if you had 10 rules, if you were going to put 10 rules in place, that those are the 10 rules you get for everyone to be able to live good lives and not be bad people and not harm each other, what would those 10 rules be? They do not at all resemble. Like, where's don't rape, right? Where is don't molest children or don't own other people? Where is that stuff, right? But instead we have like, don't take the Lord's name in vain or other gods before that. And again, all of that is sold. The reason I say that, all of that is sold as a wholesome way to look at the world. And I think not only is it a cop out, I think it's a dangerous one.
yeah, I think the slavery one too is always such a bizarre one that I didn't and other people didn't pick up on it when we were Christians because it not only doesn't say don't own slaves, it gives you prescriptions on how much you can beat them, which is like, it says literally like if you beat them hard and they can get up from their mat within 2 days, you're okay. But if they can't or they die, then you're in trouble. But you can beat the tarnation out of them. To beat someone up where they can't get up for 2 days, but after 2 days they finally can, that's a pretty big beating, and that's quite okay. And the fact that you can bequeath slaves to your children and grandchildren, it's like, oh, and yeah, it's like God doesn't seem like anything more than an ancient Canaanite tribal demigod written by tribal men who knew nothing about the real world.
Well, and women were property, so they treated women basically sometimes worse than because, like there's if a woman was unclean, then you can cut off her hand or you can like, all kinds of
Yeah. If she grabs a man's genitals while they're fighting. Yeah.
yeah.
And the other part too that's really horrible to think about is the passage that talks about if a woman is raped, the rapist just pays the daddy 30 shekels of silver or something, and so now she has to go live with her rapist as her husband. Yeah, it goes on and on and on. So I did want to ask, just going back to the primary part of your story, at what point did this really culminate to the point where you were saying to yourself, I really have to re-examine my worldview, my faith system? At what point did it culminate to the point where there's like splinters in your mind that you just couldn't get out? And how did that eventually snowball into your actual deconversion? And what was that process like?
Yeah, I was an undergrad, and again studying biology and chemistry, and I just remember being really confused because I felt like there still had to be something else out there. I just didn't know what it was, and I felt like the story that I had been told was probably not true. So I did relatively quickly convert from not believing in Christianity and then not and then accepting like science, evolution, and so on. Um, and fully came into this idea of feminism, and especially once I realized how much religion is used to maintain sexist power structures. But then like I that's fascinating because I remember looking for a period of time on like ancient religions where God was female and being really fascinated with those. And honestly, those made more sense. The women can give life, right? It makes more sense for men to control women's um, mating and birthing so that the children are theirs. Um, that religion structure made sense to me, but maybe God was feminine, and or maybe God wasn't sexed at all, or maybe there wasn't a God, but spiritual beings. And then it all started to just feel kind of wooey. And then I left all that altogether. And then finally just sort of accepted it. But then comes the process of, well, do you tell people? How do you tell people? Like, do I actually come out? And that's still a hard thing.
When you were at that point of deconverting and just saying, I don't believe any of it anymore, did you ever, well, two parts, did you ever fear that you were deceiving yourself and or that the devil was deceiving you? And did anybody try to, when you did open up to Christians eventually, did you have people trying to say, like, this is just a misunderstanding, you've been in the wrong church, you've been on the wrong teaching and interpretation? If you had the right people around you and the right understanding of scripture, you'd understand that God isn't against women, he's actually quite pro women. And just people trying to reshape your narrative and pull you back in. Did anybody do that, or did you do it to yourself at all?
I think I was mostly quiet about what I believed for a long time and pretty convinced at that point at the my belief in Christianity in particular has gone from it's absolutely true to questioning it to boom, that does not make any sense to yeah, I don't believe it. How in the world can other people believe this? And And that's kind of where I am, but I still try to be pretty quiet about it, mostly because a lot of, especially back home, A lot of friends and family are still Christians. Um, and as a science communicator and educator, I know there can be a lot of conflicts or perceived conflicts with religion. And so I try not to be too open about it because honestly, I don't think that my belief in religion is relevant to science. Um, but it is still something that I fear would turn certain people off. I have had a lot of family in particular, especially my husband's family. They tend to be quite religious, who we either don't tell things to. Funny story. So we were out of the church. Actually, so my husband and I started dating senior year of college, and he was always basically an atheist, but was never out to his family. And so we always agreed on that. And got married very soon. And then just I was a biologist and a feminist and out of the church. Well, his family is very close, and they would have these big family reunions, and it was such a fascinating thing for me. Like I'd never seen Black family reunions, and they're a thing. They're awesome and so much fun. And there's like t-shirts and schedules and tournaments, and but they always culminate in Sunday morning church. So we were, and his family's from the South, and we were at one of them. This was relatively early on, and the cousins were all telling us, oh, this is such a great church. They love everybody. It doesn't matter what color you are. They're so welcoming. And thought, okay, well, as far as church services go, it can't be that bad. So the first hour they sang, that was pretty fun. Second hour was the sermon. And the sermon was all about how we're killing babies but saving whales. And feminism was the cause of basically all of these problems. And these women just need to learn their place. And I remember sitting, seriously, this was the whole second hour. And I'm like, his hand, I've got his hand. He's like,
I bet.
left, I kid you not, they routed us through the gift shop. It felt like the Disney World version of church. But again, it's how churches, in my mind, can get away with this wholesome um, veneer, but hiding these more insidious messages that if you're not paying attention or not aware of them, then they can really sneak up on you. So anyway, I now really do my best to just avoid that aspect of those family gatherings because it raises too many uncomfortable questions. My husband's able to sit there and like out of body and not really listen to what's being said, but all I hear is, the 8-year-old in me that you're less than, you should be shameful because you're female and you're the cause of all sin in the world. And I just won't do it anymore.
Mm.
Oh, thank you. I feel
It's
better.
it's amazing. I really do relate to some of that because my background is very much the whole uh, concept for women of. Are you familiar with what's called stay-at-home daughters? You know that concept?
Do I want to know?
Well, it's you probably could assume it, but it's basically the idea of because of feminism being so toxic in their minds, when you get of age, if you're not being passed on to a husband, your best path is to stay at home and focus on caring for the family that you've been grown up in, and basically you stay under the auspices and authority of your daddy until you get married. So if you're 25 and in many of those circles, that's a horrible thing to be that old and still single. But if you're 25, as a woman, you stay home. You might have a small career running like a flower shop or something, but you're not going to like be a career woman. And if that stays that way until you're 30, 35, like God has a plan, he's making you wait for your husband and it's going to be good in the end, but you stay at home so you don't get sullied by the world. And so that's the background I'm used to. And honestly, to my shame, I'll admit that's the background that I didn't have a chance to really preach on that ever, but I would have preached that that's a good thing. And I say that again to my shame. But that's the background that I'm used to. And a lot of these women that I'm used to seeing when they see the feminism and they look at that versus the life that they want. They say, I really truly don't want to go to work. I want to raise 4 to 6 to 8 to 300,000 kids, and I want a farm, and I want a homestead, and I want essential oils, and I don't want to give my kids vaccines. I want that life. I want my kids barefoot, and I want myself pregnant as much as I can. And they're like, this isn't repressive to me. This feels like the most exquisitely beautiful life I could possibly have. And it's really hard because I've seen both worlds very much up close. And some of these women that I've been associated with or come across over the years, they really love that life. They're not seeing it as like, I have to do this, but it's for the kingdom. I'm taking one for the team. I'm being abused for they're like, no, my husband is lovely to me. And he knows that the deepest desire of my heart is to do this, to be a homemaker, to homestead. And they, of course, surround themselves with dozens or hundreds of other women doing the same thing, preaching the same thing, Instagram it up. And they're just like, feminism has nothing to offer. Anything that would take me away from my kids, in my family, in my home, would just be a step down significantly. And so I struggle with how to find a balance to say, you can still homestead, you can still have lots of babies if you want them and still love them with your whole heart. But that doesn't mean the same thing as saying women can't do this. It's a different thing to say women, you know, can do this and they can choose either path versus they should just never take that path. And I think it's been a real struggle for me to figure out the best way to be involved in that discussion because, again, so many of them they don't feel repressed at all. They feel quite empowered by ultra fundamentalist conservative Christianity. It's a weird dynamic. You know what I mean?
No, I absolutely know what you mean. I've seen the other side of that, and I have come through it, and I hold a different view. So it is offensive to me to hear that, but I know it's true. And the thing is, it's really hard, like when you have been taught fundamentally that your purpose is this, right? Your purpose is to make babies and to serve men, and that is your path to the kingdom of God. Then what is free will? What are the choices that we make within that system? And so they're not freely made choices. Like all of us make choices within what we know as how the world works. And they're making choices as they know how. And I can get how it might feel empowering. My mom, again, through one side of her mouth would say, you can do anything anybody with a penis can do. But she would also say, no, Melanie, I actually get where the church is coming from because, like, if a man loves his wife like Jesus loved the church, then he would do anything for her and she would do anything for him. Like, hmm. But we're not talking about a partnership there. We're talking about a power structure. And the power structure isn't based on abilities or inherent choices. It's based on um, who we are told we are through divine ways. And not all that's to say, I have met it. I can imagine myself going back in time through any civilization throughout history, because slavery, for example, is as old as human history. And finding a slave who would say, you know what, my master is good to me. This is empowering. I love being here. I wouldn't choose any place else. Right. But is that a free will choice that's made, or is it something that that person has been taught about how the world works, about their place, and is justifying to themselves because they don't have any other way?
Mm.
I don't know how to talk to somebody in that position because it so is offensive to everything that um, it honestly, it triggers me because
Yeah.
of what I taught as a kid. I probably would not be as empathetic and kind as you are.
Well, in
And
part
I,
ways, because of my marriage situation, I have to just, it's part of what I see all the time. But yeah, I get it. It is very offensive. And especially too, knowing that I was thinking about how, even though there might be some women who would say, I feel so empowered for everyone that says this is the best thing ever, how many women are quietly suffering with abuse and feel like they can't get out? And how many people they're, for example, not looking at that, want that life at all. Maybe they're homosexual and they do not that they don't fit in anywhere in that paradigm. Like, where do they fit? There's so many ways that this can go south so quickly.
So back to like my husband and I hyphenated our names. So my husband is a descendant of slaves on both sides of his family. His family name is passed down through the male line, but was ultimately given to him by the slave owners when they freed them. Okay. Um, how many men would consider changing their name when they got married? Like, how many people in general think about where that comes from? And if you, as a man, wouldn't consider changing your name, then what does that say about where that tradition comes from and what you're expecting of other people and the sort of baseline assumptions that we're putting into why we do things? There are right answers. There are a million right answers for a million different people. All I'm saying is that we should question these things, really think about where they come from, and make conscious choices. Um, and really try to see the kinds of inequities that are built into the system that we've never questioned before. We may come to the same place. I don't know. But right now, we're not questioning them. And the name thing is something that really, again, triggers me as well, because I see this conversation going on all the time. Like, it's just taken as a given. But why? Like, why do we do that? Okay. Would you change your name? I'm not talking to you particularly. Like a man, would you change your name? Okay. Why? Right. So just ask these questions. Think about where they come from and then make informed decisions.
Yeah, I think that too transcends the religious topic as well, where just broadening it out to race relations in general, the way our world works, the way money works. Yeah, there's so many ways in which we're just assuming that the system we're in is close to an ideal, or at least we're going to stick with it and not try to change it. And it's amazing to be. I forget how the saying goes, but something like we're on the we're on the team of culture changers. Like we're going to do this, and we're not watching it from the sidelines. We're actually going to be on the change management team. And in many ways, you kind of have to dream big to be able to do that, and kind of start in your own mind with cleaning the slate and saying, what are my assumptions? If I can try to identify them all, what are my assumptions? Clean them away and say, is this really the only way? Like, for example, changing topics entirely. Like, one of the things that changed for me a lot was the topic of sexuality when I deconverted. It wasn't a big deal because I wasn't looking to make any changes, but I suddenly thought, like in the first week or two, if someone was really into polyamory, like, is that, if everybody's consenting, like, is that wrong? Like, there is no right and wrong. Like, it's, if that's right for a certain couple, it's right for a certain couple. That's not bad. If someone is anything like that, there's no reason, as long as everyone is consenting, that you need to assign words like right and wrong and bad or good or toxic. This is just people choosing different paths. And it's amazing how much all the assumptions, you really have to do some hard work, but you realize we've all assumed so much with all these topics. And I love that deconversion doesn't obviously fix them all, but at least gives you the humility to say, I really need to go back. I need to backtrack on this. I need to unlearn what I've learned, as Yoda would say. I need to unlearn what I've learned and try to figure out a better path forward. And I love too, as much as Christianity in some ways is so much to blame for all these things, in many ways they kind of plant the seeds of these thoughts. And I'm not the first one to say this. This is not original, but they ask you to continually search the scriptures to see if these things are so. That's the Bible. They talk about the Bereans in a place called Berea, where they said the Bereans were more noble because they investigated the scriptures to see if these things were so. First Timothy talks about study to make yourself approved as a workman who can rightly divide the word of truth. So it keeps on saying, study, figure it out, have discernment, think twice about this. Are you seeing it the right way? And they kind of set you up to have discernment. The problem is they never realize that they're setting you up to have discernment about their own worldview. And eventually you say, yeah, I've been spending my whole life saying, am I seeing this right? Am I seeing this right? Am I seeing that scripture right? Am I seeing this theology right? Eventually you broaden that out just a little bit further. Am I seeing my worldview correctly? And I remember, just as an incidental, I went to New Guinea for a missions trip years ago for about 6 weeks, lived with tribal people in grass huts. And over there, a lot of the women don't wear shirts. The tribal women just, they might wear some kind of shorts or something. But even something as simple and irrelevant in some ways as that, it's like, is it really wrong for a woman to have bare breasts? Is it wrong for a man to see that? Of course, as from a conservative Christian perspective, that's anathema. You don't do that. But then to realize in other cultures, that's completely acceptable. Like, why are my assumptions and my cultural background so firm in my mind? And it's amazing that deconversion gives you at least a starting point to say, back it up. You've assumed so much, and like you said, your free will has been manipulated. You've got all these assumptions that have been stuck in your brain since childhood. You need to identify them and figure out if they're actually worthwhile.
Wow. Um, wow. Yeah. And something that you said in there got me thinking about c- back to my deconversion story. So when I left and then started exploring other options, and I finally just thought, you know what, I don't believe. I think I'm an atheist. And I found the atheist movement, especially like the new atheists at the time. Um, and it didn't take very long before I saw how much misogyny and sexism was in that community
Hmm.
that I really thought, I don't now know where I belong. I was shocked. Actually, in some ways, that bothered me more because these were people that I thought had left that and assumptions. I had my own reasons for leaving. I thought maybe those were amongst theirs as well, but maybe not. And they just carried the same sort of sexist ideas with them. And so I just felt really homeless then for a very long time.
Hmm.
Um,
That's really sad to hear. Can you tell me more about the sexism? Like, I don't know if I've been exposed to that part of it. I mean, my focus again was much more on the mythology and almost purely on that. But could you tell me more about like what you were seeing?
Yeah, there's it's not necessarily using a deity to justify uh, power structures, and that's what I found within Christianity. It was more the same kinds of attitudes um, about women, and even not just having the same sort of sexist ideas. It was also this. This is what it felt like. Um, these were mostly men who had taken themselves through that process and left religion. Um, the sense that I got is because they were very intelligent to do so. And because they were so intelligent to do so, they were so smart that all of their ideas were even more right, right? They were even more entrenched in their beliefs. And so some of the sexist pushback that I got in that community was, um, yeah, it was really an eye opener. And I think in hindsight, it cements the idea that sexism is inherent to religion. It's inherent to humanity. And we use religion to justify what it is that we want to believe. And we do that all the time with religious beliefs. So why not that one? It's just that I had made the assumption um, that they were smart enough not to do that because that's how they presented themselves. And so in some ways
Hmm.
it was even more hurtful because I had left a tribe that taught me I was less than and then moved on to something that I thought would be more enlightened. And in the ways that they weren't, they were even more firm in their beliefs. And yeah, I mean, to this day, some of the sexism that I receive from the secular men in particular tends to be some of the worst.
Hmm. It's I was not aware of that. That's really horrible. I definitely would like to be part of the change management team that changes that dynamic for sure. I do love. I will admit it's been awesome to interview so many women who've come on the channel and to feel like at least that's a small part of the puzzle is just saying their stories are so powerful and so valuable. It's interesting too that you mentioned feminism because when I was the first exposure I really got to anyone in my circle of friends that was deconverted long before I deconverted. I'd grown up with a girl named Susan in a Christian school. I've even interviewed her, so if anyone wants to go see it, it's one of my early interviews. Susan was a wonderful girl. She and her brother were classmates with me. Her dad was a Christian school teacher there. My dad taught at the same Christian school. We grew up Bible quizzing, memorizing thousands of verses together, literally. Just she was on fire for the Lord, and she was one of those people that amongst the Christian school kids, you could tell she loved Jesus. She wasn't there because her parents made her. She wanted the meat of the word. She wanted to grow in her knowledge of the Lord and to make a difference for the kingdom. And all of a sudden, I'm haven't talked to her for a while. We've all graduated and moved on with our lives, gone separate ways. And somebody from that background emails me something. Did you hear what happened with Susan? I was like, no, what's up with Susan? I'm thinking the worst, like it was an accident. To like, she's deconverted. She doesn't believe in God anymore. I'm like, what? No, there's no way, not Susan. And I reached out to her by email. This was 10 years before my deconversion. 10 years. And I just said, hey, Susan, I'm just curious. I haven't touched base with you in a while. I'm sorry it's been a while, but I'm just curious. Are you doing okay? What's up? And she explained the whole thing, this long email. And it basically said, Tim, you don't realize that Christianity is all about patriarchy. And I thought, oh, snap. She went to secular college. She got exposed to some ultra feminist professor, some kind of fascist, communist, bizarro worldview and all. She got suckered. Oh, that's a shame. Fortunately, I didn't say anything. I just said, I obviously, would see this differently, but I still care about you. And, we kind of left it on a good note, which I'm glad I did. And 10 years later, I went back to that same email chain and I was like, it's time to eat crow. It's time to eat crow. And I reached back out and said, Susan, I know I haven't really talked to you in 10 years now since this last email, but I see it now. It took me 10 years since you said something, but I see it. You're right. And again, mine was more mythology, but I see the patriarchy, I see the feminist issue. And I had to apologize for not being more respectful and open to her ideas. But it was amazing that that was what got her out, is seeing these issues, that the Bible does reinforce the idea that women are subservient, women are bad, and men are in charge, and men are better. And it's just, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yes. I need to listen to that interview, so I will be
Yeah,
pulling it up.
it's powerful. I'll send you the link. I'll also link it for anyone else beneath this video if anyone wants to see it. Going back to your story, I know we've gone on for a while. I did want to make sure we carved out a little bit of time to talk about your platform. Again, for everyone, I'll have the links all beneath this video. But thinking is power. Uh, you're doing great work there. Could you tell us, how did your story? Obviously, the dots are connected here. How did your story go from you went through this process to you needed to share some of what you've learned with the world?
That actually came from, so I moved to Massachusetts and was teaching at a community college. And I love teaching. And I was teaching the gen ed science classes. Like when you don't want to be a scientist when you grow up, most of the time you take intro bio. And I was teaching intro bio, and I just like it. I taught that class for over 10 years probably, and I used like half dozen different books, and I taught it every way I knew how to try to make it interesting and relevant to students. And I finally just realized that if I had a single semester to teach the average person what they needed to know about science, that was not it. So, to my department's credit, I went to them and I said, I think we need to rethink our non-majors gen ed science classes. And if you let me, I'm going to create something. And so I went into this like deep dive on what does the average person need to know? And it was a really humbling process because I learned how much I did not know. And all of this was in a service of trying to figure out what would be most useful to students. And what I ended up with is this what I call teach skills, not facts approach. And the skills are critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy. And importantly, it's in that order. And so instead of the this is where I start to go because this is something I care so deeply about. The most commonly used, I'm not going to name names, the most commonly used intro bio textbook for this class around the country is over 800 pages long. And in the very first chapter, there's about 4 pages devoted to the process of science. And the rest of it is a bunch of really interesting factoids, but they're just a bunch of things students need to memorize and regurgitate for an exam. And I realized they're just going to regurgitate them and forget them. And they're going to leave hating science as much as when they got to me. And they're going to not understand how science works. And this was before the pandemic. And I keep thinking about how much I failed those students because we saw a new virus, we see a new vaccine. Do masks work? What masks? In what situations? What is the best vaccination strategy? What age groups are most of it? All of that was new science because we didn't know. So it was science playing out in real time, and I didn't give my students the tools to understand that. And so that's what I tried to do. And in the process, I created a website based on the idea that knowledge is great, but there's too much to know. And so instead of knowledge is power, thinking is power. Like none of us have the ability to know everything, and we carry access to basically all of humanity's knowledge in our pockets. The question is, when you need knowledge, can you find it? And can you think through it to make a wise decision? And so I created Thinking is Power in the process and have been pleasantly surprised that people actually are interested in learning about these concepts. I can talk to you about how I teach them and why, and also what I've learned about how to have better conversations, how to think through our beliefs, how to, in the science class, there's always areas where religious beliefs are perceived to conflict. And so how to think about those things as well.
I was curious with all of this amazing background with science literacy, critical thinking. One of the things that's really been difficult for me, both in terms of people that I have in my family, extended family, and even people I've honestly interviewed, is the question of people who have evidence, quote unquote, and facts, and they have literacy for the exact opposite of what is the scientific consensus. For example, someone comes to mind that I have come to know as someone that's a very good critical thinker, that I've appreciated for many of his insights, but he has extensive evidence in his mind that global warming is not real. And in addition, the idea that vaccines haven't done anything, and he has extensive evidence that they're actually quite harmful. How do you counter the people where they come up with things like this? Because you see it all the time, and I'm not talking about the really bizarre stuff like flat earthers, but just the people that are they're going to accept evolution, they're going to accept a lot of other things that we would, but they're still going to have what I would consider, and I'm not trying to make my pay grade larger than it is, but they would still take a position that seems to be anti-science, and yet they're saying, no, that's not true. Like, for example, I remember years ago, there was a NASA director who was like the top guy. And I don't think he was there long after he said this, but he said something like, why are we assuming that the current average temperature of the Earth is the right one? Like global warming may or may not be a thing, but why are we assuming that it's the right thing? What if the best thing for this Earth is for it to warm up? How are we deciding that stuff? And I don't think he kept his job much longer after that. But you do get people that are going to take a very different perspective. And I struggle as a layperson that's not doesn't have a biology degree or anything near it to be able to get into those discussions or even understand both sides of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. One of my favorite things to talk about is why facts don't change our mind. And the short answer is because it's not about facts. So, in education circles, we've labored under the assumption for a very long time that the problem with people when they hold anti-science views is that they don't have enough information. So it's actually called the information deficit model. So in this case, like if you've got a friend who doesn't align his views with the consensus on climate change, which is overwhelming, by the way, the problem is he just doesn't have enough evidence. But as you rightly point out, that he has in his mind a lot of evidence. So one of the things that's helpful for me, the Jonathan Haidt has an elephant in the rider analogy. Are you familiar with this?
No.
So it's similar to Daniel Kahneman's System 1, System 2, but I think it's easier for people to understand. The idea is in your mind, imagine that you have an elephant and then there's a rider on top of the elephant. So the elephant is the part of the brain that is emotional and it's biased, it's tribal, it has motivations based on its instincts, its intuitions. Um, it's also always on, right? You don't have to turn on an elephant. The elephant just is powerful and it's always working. The rider is the part of your brain that you think of as you. It's the part of your brain that's capable of logical thinking, of rational thinking, of using evidence. But it's really hard to control an elephant. So usually what happens is that the elephant suggests something to the writer, and the writer goes, yeah, that sounds right. Here's all the reasons why that's right. So in this way, the writer, instead of being like a critical thinker, we think that we form our beliefs by following evidence to a conclusion. But the vast majority of the time, what happens is our elephant suggests something to us, and then the writer goes, yes, that sounds right. Here's why. So the writer acts like the elephant's PR department or its lawyer, finding reasons to justify what it already wants to believe. Now, in the case of science denial, like in particular climate change denial, the biggest indicator of climate change denial in the United States is conservative ideology, identifying as a conservative. That identity trumps the evidence. So the elephant has what it wants to believe. It suggests it to the writer. Now, we tend to think that if we're smarter or if we're more educated, then our writer does a better job of evaluating the evidence. But actually, what can happen is the writer just gets better at justifying whatever conclusion the elephant arrived at through irrational means. So, in this case, ideology, but also what's called solution aversion. We don't like the consequences of accepting a conclusion. So if you are fundamentally opposed to government regulation, like if you think government is bad and government can't do anything good, then a problem that requires government regulation is a problem for you. So deny the problem. And in this case, that's why a lot of conservative ideology in particular denies this problem. So we need to understand that's what's happening in our brain, right? To realize that there could be things motivating the conclusions that we draw and questioning those underlying motivations. But also, when we talk to other people, like I think my writer is talking to your writer, but actually there's four people in this conversation. My writer is listening to my elephant, who's talking to your writer, who's listening to your elephant, right? So if we want to have a productive conversation, then we need to think about it at that level, at the what is underneath of it, what is motivating this particular conclusion. There's one more concept here that could be helpful, which is the Van Orman Quine's web of belief ideas. And actually, I was thinking about this when you were talking about your deconversion story. If you imagine all of the beliefs in your head forming a web, so that there's all these nodes, but they all work inward, inward, inward until there's this core. And that core beliefs, those central beliefs are the most fundamental to everything else. Everything else comes out from there. Like it is the foundation for everything else. So if we're talking about beliefs over here, like a climate change belief, I don't believe in climate change. Well, that's going to come down to, well, my identity is a conservative Republican and I don't like government regulation and all of these core beliefs. So on the surface, it can look like I'm talking to you about the global average temperature over time or the change in sea ice or migration pattern, but that's not what we're talking about at all. What we're talking about are those underlying beliefs. We could talk about those facts all day long, but it's not going to matter because that's fundamentally not what it's about. Our brain prefers cohesion so that it would rather have a cohesive web of incorrect beliefs than to take out like a core belief that causes everything else to crumble. Nothing else makes sense without that there. So if we're wanting to focus on these beliefs, not only do we need to understand what's motivating them, but how they fit into the bigger picture, because we can't, if you try to change someone's mind on a particular topic, but that's part of an overall worldview, it's not going to happen.
Mm. You're reminding me of the terror concept that we talk about a lot on this channel, the idea that it's just too hard to imagine that Christianity might not be real. because of the terror of what if I don't get to see my loved one? What if I don't get to have an afterlife? What if there's no higher supernatural purpose guiding me? And it's too terrorizing, and therefore I'm just not going to even entertain those thoughts. It's not that I don't see the discussion topics on the table that you think I should talk about, or I could study. The idea is I know emotionally this is way too intense. If I go down this route, all the chips are going to fall. I just can't go down there. And therefore they will, if they talk about it at all, it's at a different level that keeps them away from that terror. And so I think that's definitely relevant to some of the other ways we're talking about religion here. And when you do face someone yourself who is just neck deep in what you might call a conspiracy theory or bad science, are there times in which you feel like you're just too far gone? This isn't worth it. Like the whole, you want to talk about whether or not, babies reproduce because storks drop them in little sacks to us. It's like if that's where your starting point is, we don't have a starting point. Like when do you decide they're too far gone? And if you were to tackle something that's more like a conspiracy theory level, whether it's about science or canon or whatever, how do you handle those more sensitive discussions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the answer is it depends. So, in class, I often joke that my students are captives for 4 months, right? Like they want a grade, so they have to stay with me for 4 months. And I purposefully set up the curriculum where this might help actually. So remind me to come back to the normals. Um, so in class, what I do is start with how do we come to our beliefs? And I start with a lecture on witchcraft. 17th, 18th, 19th centuries in Europe, we talk about the witch trials and the kinds of things people were accused of and the kinds of things people were killed for. Um, I literally tell my students, all right, I'm going to tell you a story. I don't want you to take notes. I'm going to tell you a story. And at the end, we're going to talk about why the story matters. Right. So I start science class with, okay, so Pope, was it Benedict who did the Malleus Maleficarum? The
I'm not
hammer of
familiar with
witches.
that.
Yeah, okay, so it's the hammer of witches. It's the what started the torture and witch trials.
Okay.
Okay. So basically if you were accused of witchcraft, that was the best evidence. Actually, that was the second best evidence. The best evidence was if you confessed. Now, why would you confess? Let me show you. So here is the Spanish donkey, and that is this like metal thing where with a point on the top, they put weights on your ankles and they just weight you down until it sliced you in half. Or the wheel of compassion that would roast you over the coals. Or there's the something boots with these big spikes on them. They'd heat it up and then like hit it with a hammer and it would crush all of your bones. Or they would put like oil down your back and light it on fire. Uh, Basically, they would torture you until you confess. And I will fully admit, when I put together that lecture, it still stays with me to this day. Like people are really inventive and cruel when it comes to torturing their fellow human beings. But if I accused you of causing birth defects and you denied it, and I said, oh, I think that makes you guilty, and then I tortured you until you confessed, then that was absolute proof that you were a witch, and now I could actually kill you and save your soul. All right, now why did I do this in a science class? Well, they were really convinced they were right. How good was their evidence? Where did they come up with that belief? Um, and importantly, this is not a topic that triggers students in that they don't believe it, right? Like the vast majority of my students don't hold those kinds of witchcraft beliefs. So we get to talk about how we come to our beliefs. Confidence is not a good indicator of being correct, right? What is the evidence that we have for our beliefs? Let's evaluate that. I want them to internalize it, but I start by externalizing it and using an example that doesn't isn't personal to them. And then I move on to the limits of our perception and memory. And we talk about ghosts and UFOs. And then we do mediums, psychic mediums. And like, I'm not disproving any of these things. I'm just, let's evaluate the evidence and how good is it? I teach them about their biases, about logical fallacies, and about how to find good information. I do all of that step by step in a purposeful attempt to get them to a place where I call it critical thinking training wheels. Like, we don't learn to ride a bike by going downhill on a mountain bike first without training wheels, right? We learn in a safe place without too much stress. We get the skills and then we build up from there. And so I'm doing that with students. I'm getting them to practice this process of evaluating beliefs, about thinking, about being skeptical, about evaluating evidence. And I'm doing all of that without talking about vaccines and climate change and evolution, because if I do that, I'm automatically going to turn off some of the students. It is much harder to do online, right? Because they don't have to stick with me for 4 months in a linear fashion where I break them down and I build them back up again. But online, I often joke that my focus, my audience is the normals. Those are the people in the middle of a bell curve. People over here, they don't need me. People over here, with my time, ability, skill set, I'm probably not going to reach them. But there's a huge group in the middle that is movable, right? Like the woman at my gym recently was like, "What is critical thinking?" That's a normal, right? I can talk to that. People just don't know. And so we tend to think that the extremists are our audience, but they're not. If we move enough of the middle, then the extremists, those at the extreme, become less relevant. Now, that said, if you have someone in your life who is at that extreme that you really want to reach and save, then I commend you. I would say that if you don't do it, no one else is probably going to. I don't want to put that pressure on anybody because if you don't want to make it responsibility, it is not your responsibility. But the more we leave them to only other people that hold those same extreme beliefs, then the less likely we are to be able to save them. Your personal connection with someone who holds those beliefs and being that safe place where they can come to with real questions and not feel mocked or belittled for those beliefs, not feel ostracized, and actually have a safe place to talk about those things might be the only thing holding them to some level of sanity where they might come back.
Hmm. I've got so many things I want to ask about and say at that point. It's overwhelming, the daunting task. But I love how you're kind of simplifying it and just saying focus on the people in the middle that you can address. And I think too, I would just add to that for my own journey. For the people that are at the extreme, in some ways, it's not like you want to ever write someone off and say, "I was sorry, you're just too far gone." But in many ways, sometimes it is just a matter of time. Like I look at my own life and I think it took you 43 years to escape. Why does someone else have to escape in 6 or 12 months? It's like you took your time. For me, the starting point was singing some Christian songs, Christian kid songs that were about Joshua and Jericho, and in the bigger picture, the Bible stories were about genocide and land theft and all that stuff. And it was what got my wheels rolling. But from that point, it took me 3 or so years to actually deconvert. But when I think about that, it's like it took you at least 3 years from the point we even admitted there's a problem. No one else has to be on your time frame. And I think to give people that patience and grace, but also to figure out like if you're going to pick that battle, if that is going to be your battle to address someone that is in an extremist position, is it worth it? Can you do it without, getting frustrated and so forth? And there are honestly ways in which I feel like I do the same thing with my comments on YouTube. I get endless comments, as you might imagine, of, you're a fool. The fool is said in his heart, there's no God, which is a Bible verse from whatever, Psalms 14. And, there's hell waiting for you, endless nastygrams. And I know other people that are colleagues in YouTube that get those nastygrams and they start to answer them. And I've made the decision for myself, like it's not worth it. I'm going to address the people that are going to at least be willing to admit that there are serious problems with the mythology, with the worldview. even if they're not ready to go leave it, they're just willing to say, yeah, there's some problems here. We do Houston, we do have a problem. And those people I can talk to, the people that are just going to say you're horrible and the devil's working through you, to me, they're just so far gone that by and large, unless there's some diamond in the rough, I don't really go down that path. I just kind of walk away from those conversations. But it is hard. It's hard because especially when you can do that with a stranger, but when it's a loved one, where it's like, okay, this is my family, this is my spouse, this is my parents, these are my siblings, and especially if they're in ministry themselves, where they're not just agreeing with these bad ideas, but they're actually perpetuating them publicly in their ministry. It's like, wow, like this is hard. These are hard decisions. It breaks your heart because you want to make a difference, and yet your nearest loved ones are espousing very toxic ideas. So I definitely get the struggle. It's real.
Yeah, I learned early on to set boundaries for myself because people can be really cruel, and I don't owe anyone my time. I choose my battles as well. There are some commenters that I am just like, I'm going to block you because you're not here in good faith. I get a lot of blatant misogyny. So, like, that's just going to go. Um, there are some people, though, that I do try to engage with, and not necessarily for their benefit, but there are a lot of people watching the conversation that might benefit from it.
Mm,
And it's never like I don't know anyone who has, I changed my entire worldview because of this Facebook comment that I saw. Like none of us do that. None of us do that. We do change our minds, but it's a much slower process. So it's not often like I can't take my reasoning and download it into your brain. The best I can do is show you what my reasoning looks like, model that process of reasoning, of modeling good conversation, respectful conversation, and trying to plant a seed that hopefully grows into something else.
yeah, well said. Hmm. Well, I know we've gone on for a while. I'm going to just ask you two quick questions. One of them is going to go actually backtrack a second for to your story or to your life, and then I'm going to come back to your work as a final question. It'll be a lot shorter. But my question, going back to your journey personally, as we wrap up here, is how has the healing gone? What are some of the things that you might even recommend to other people to think about? And I don't necessarily mean the obvious ones like, consider a therapist and find community, but like, is there anything specific that has helped you in your healing journey? Or at least just, how is the healing journey going for you at this point? You're, like you said, you're more removed from it in some ways than I was. I'm at this point, but I'm sure, like we all know, some of these things do come back and kind of sting from our past, and especially sting when we see people still stuck in it and hurting from it. But how's the healing process been for you, and what would you say to anyone who's going through it too?
Yeah, I think the hardest thing for me is okay, again, uh, personal here. I love Christmas. It is my favorite holiday. Like I put up my tree. My husband's birthday is November 6th, and the rule in our house is that I get to put up the tree the day after his birthday. And so it's up for like 2 solid months. Christmas music
Wow.
is favorite music. I now like I call it, I mean, there's so much paganism in Christmas, right? So I get to joke about it that way. My husband's also a choral conductor, and choral music at Christmas is the thing. And a lot of that just it honestly at this point it triggers me. Like I go to some of these things and the veneration of one woman because she hasn't been touched, and about God and man, and that like the whole thing is just all that's to say, I have found that it's really important for me, but very difficult at sometimes to set boundaries. Um, I know what triggers me, and I do my best to avoid some of those situations. But there are times that I got to go to a Christmas concert and sit and listen to that stuff. And I am sitting in the pew just ready to like blow my top off. Because not only am I upset for myself, I'm upset for all of these children who are hearing these messages that I have found to be really harmful and traumatizing. So I guess boundaries are the best thing I can come up with.
Mm. Yeah, it's a great answer, and I agree. It's with the kids involved at all. It's you have to be willing to admit that this is psychological child abuse. I mean, when you do these things that we've touched on earlier in the interview, it's like this isn't benign stuff. This is stuff that really truly messes with you. Everything from the biggest equations of atonement and the wickedness and hell and the afterlife and the end time stuff. If God's going to come back, and you better be on the right side, or he'll get you, or the Antichrist will, or something. Everything to the purity culture of you need to cover up. Your body is inherently bad, so many ways in which this is so bad for kids, and it breaks my heart. It's one of my biggest, besides the interviews, is my biggest motivation is to eventually create a platform that's much more focused on children. And of course, I've got 4 little ones that are my big motivation. Going to back for my last question to your platform, what would people like if people were to go to your websites? What can they find? What would be the best place for them to kind of get started if they look at it and like, oh, there's all these videos? What would you recommend for someone that's kind of like blown away by how much you're doing? What's the right place to start? And if we were to really kind of get plugged into your platform, what you're doing, what are some of the things that we can expect over the next couple of years? Like, what are your projects on your horizon?
So on my website, I've actually created, if you go to Thinking is Power, the Foundations tab is my attempt at making like critical thinking mini course. Actually, it's a mini course in the critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy skills that I teach my students. So in a perfect world, what people would do is go to the Foundations tab, start at the beginning, and work their way through it. If you're an educator, there's a For Educators tab. I'm working on that a whole lot. I'm creating curriculum. I use a lot of pseudoscience and science now, misinformation in class. I have students create misinformation so that they can learn the techniques of misinformation. So pay attention to that space. If you're an educator, there's more of that to come. I'm trying to build more video. Uh, Video scares the poo out of me, but I am trying. So I have a YouTube channel. I've started on TikTok and so on. Facebook is my biggest platform. I'm currently writing a book, so we'll see where that goes.
Nice.
Hope able
What's the topic?
The topic is about creating misinformation. It's about learning the techniques of misinformation by creating it. So I have my students do this. So like for example, I don't know if you can see my cup here.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yep.
bird. Okay. Do you know this conspiracy theory?
I don't know.
It's hysterical. The idea is that the United States government killed all the birds in the 60s and 70s. So all the birds you see today are spy drones. So, like when you see them on power lines, it's because they're charging up, right? When
Love
you're
it.
tracking you. I mean, it's satire. But if you want to learn how conspiratorial thinking works, this is a great example. Okay, now make your own conspiracy theory. So I have my students make conspiracy theories and then defend them against disproof, which is like one of the key elements of conspiracy theories is there's always a way to reinterpret evidence as supporting the conspiracy theory. The concept is unfalsifiability. They're unfalsifiable. So basically, the book is about teaching people how misinformation works by teaching them how it's made.
Hmm. I was going to say, when you talk so much about misinformation and conspiracy theories, I'm thinking, like, this is an election year. What an incredibly ironic timing. I know we're only in February, but November will be here before we know it, and a lot of interesting, soap operas between now and November. And like, I mean, this is probably one of the most timely messages that we all could be thinking about is how do you weed through misinformation, especially when we're all keenly aware that our world is full of propaganda machines. And like, can we actually see past the propaganda? Because this is just we're all that like this world is right in front of us every day. How do you weed through it?
Yeah, yes. If you want more on that, there's an information literacy playlist on my YouTube channel, and I even talk about like how to think about information and fact check. Um, I think one of the most important things we're talking about misinformation, people tend to focus on the misinformation itself. And but if we back up, we need to realize why we fall for it. What are our vulnerabilities? Like listening to the elephant, what kinds of things does my elephant tend to fall for and why? And then realizing that's when you need to be the most skeptical and learn how to fact check.
Mm, well said. Well said. Well, I know we're running short on time here. Could I ask, was there anything I didn't ask about that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, I'm good. This has been a joy. And you're right, I can see it's a bit like a counseling session. Thank you for the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been great to get to know you. Well, I'll just wrap up by saying, everyone, again, we've been speaking with Melanie Trecek-King. Please do like and subscribe, especially to our YouTube channel. Let's get that channel way over the finish line. But thank you so much for what you're doing. We need your voice in the community so badly. Really appreciate your time today, sharing your story and your insights. And I definitely want to do it again sometime. Look forward to meeting you in BajaCon in August. But thank you again for your time today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yep. Have a great day.